Hey,
I'd rather keep on.
welcome to our Committee of the Whole meeting, Monday, November 18th. We will start by recognizing that we're holding our meeting on the unceded traditional territories of Sechot and Hoopachesit First Nations. Would somebody like to move adoption or approval of our agenda?
Second, Madam Mayor.
All in favor? Carried. And we have meetings from our July 15th, 2009, 4 p.m. Committee of the Whole meeting.
Second, Madam Mayor.
Any comments on the minutes? All in favor? Carried. And that brings us to our one item on the agenda, which is our delegation from BC Assessment. We have Cynthia Wright, Deputy Assessor for Vancouver Island Region, in attendance to discuss BC Assessment's role in the community. Welcome.
Am I on? Okay, just checking. Well, thank you for having me, Mayor and Councillor. And I've put together a fairly substantial presentation for you. But to me, it's partly just a conversation as well. So feel free to ask questions, interject as we go along, and I'll pause for questions as well. So. To me, it's really about making sure you also understand everything we do. So if I'm going too fast or if I'm going too slow, just let me know and I can pick up the pace. I did bring copies of the presentation for you. Did you want that now or later? Okay. Let me see where I put them. So should be plenty.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, it's got you spots to do your note taking. Yeah, so today just really want to cover just about BC Assessment. We'll talk a bit about valuation principles, highest and best use, which plays into the valuation. I'm going to talk about classification and exemptions, the assessment appeal cycles, the assessment cycle key dates, the relationship between assessment and taxation, and I'm going to go over some of the 2019 assessment role statistics, as well as talking a little bit about collaborating with BC Assessment. So usually, depending on how many questions, you can take about an hour and a half to kind of get through the full presentation. So if there's more questions, it'll be longer. If you're silent, it'll be shorter. So I'm hoping for lots of questions. So we're just going to start with a little fun video that we have on our public website. So you're more than welcome to check out our YouTube channel after. We do have lots of good videos.
Milltown, a typical town
Make
with
it full
typical
screen.
townsfolk. But when it rains, the whole town, from the mayor to its mouse, have the same messy problem: mud. Milltown's mud is affecting everyone. The shopkeeper can't keep his shop clean. The widow Swenson can't safely walk down the street. The only way to get to your wagon is to trudge through the mud. And a mayor with muddy shoes, well, that just isn't mayorly. What Milltown needs is a brand new boardwalk along Main Street. But who will pay for the new boardwalk? Everyone gathered at a town meeting to figure out what to do. Some folks said the shops along Main Street should pay for the boardwalk because they would benefit the most. Others thought that because the rich folks had more money, they could afford to pay more. The farmers felt that they would have to raise their prices if they had to pay for the boardwalk, and the business owners of the wagon shop and the sawmill thought that they would have to raise prices too. The widow Swenson said she was on fixed income and wondered if she had to pay the same as everyone else. And the railway owner didn't show up at all, so some folks thought he should pay for everything. What they did agree on was that as a community, everyone had a collective interest in the good of the town. And the one thing they had in common was they all owned property in Milltown. So it was decided that each property would be taxed, and a portion of the money collected would be used to pay for the new boardwalk. What seemed fair to everyone was to tax each property based on its value and how it was being used. So the owners of the wagon shop, the sawmill, and the shops along Main Street would have to pay more tax because of how their properties were being used. And based on the value of their property, the folks who lived in bigger houses and in better neighborhoods would end up paying more tax than the average homeowner. It was decided that farmers would get a break because higher taxes would mean the price of food would increase, and this would affect everyone in Milltown. And everyone agreed it didn't make sense to tax properties like schools and churches because they were already publicly funded and provided services available to everyone. And even though the widow Swenson lived on Main Street and her property could be developed in the future, it was agreed that she would pay less tax because she had lived on the property for many years. In 1974, the Assessment Act and BC Assessment were formed from principles just like these. BC Assessment was created to provide uniform assessments which are relied upon to build sustainable communities throughout BC. The good people at BC Assessment determine the value of your property, send out a notice once a year, and then ask you to decide if the value is accurate. To keep things fair, you have the option to check and compare the values of other property assessments online. Thanks to the funding generated from your property taxes, improvements like a new boardwalk and services like police, fire, schools, and hospitals are made possible in your community. From Milltown to your town, BC Assessment. We value BC.
So I think that's sort of a good short synopsis. Oh, I think you need to.
They are homeowners, and each January, they receive a property assessment notice from BC Assessment, along with all other property owners in BC.
Just there you go.
Later in this
We'll get to that one later. Yeah, I think it's a good little video that really just short and simple, illustrates what BC Assessment does and the principles behind us. As I said, it is on our YouTube channel, and I believe from meeting with staff earlier that they actually do link some of those videos through from your website as well. So BC Assessment was created in 1974, and essentially at that time there were over 140 independent organizations completing the assessment function across BC, and there was no consistency, there was no real legislation behind that function as well. Most municipalities were doing their own assessing of properties as well as taxing properties. So, there wasn't an independence of function there. So there was a lot of inconsistency that property owners didn't understand how their taxes were generated, how their assessments were generated either. So BC Assessment was created to bring that uniformity back to the assessment, independence from the taxing function, even though we're a part of the taxing function, and using market value as a basis for the assessment, which is a lot easier for property owners to comprehend and understand why the value is what it is. So every year, BC Assessment does create an assessment role for each municipality in the province and regional district. It identifies ownership, value, classification, and exemptions for properties. There's over 2 million properties with a total value of 1.99 trillion in the province. And last year, that generated over 8 billion in annual property taxes across the province. Any kind of questions on our history? Just before I didn't think so. So as I mentioned, we do look at market value as of July 1st when we create our assessments. And that's probably about 95% of the properties are valued on market value, most residential commercial properties. And the definition of market value is the most probable price a property should bring in a competitive market under all conditions requisite to a fair sale. The buyer and seller acting prudently and knowledgeably and assuming the price is not affected by undue stimulus. So if you think about it, if you were out going to buy a house, you're not being unduly motivated. The vendor's not unduly motivated because they have to sell for bankruptcy purposes or estate or anything of that nature. Then the market price that is negotiated would be considered market value. We also have legislated values, which are regulated through various regulations. Many of these are still have a basis in market value. So for example, we assess cable, for example. So we look at they have a regulation that determines per kilometer of cable that's in the ground, it is assessed at a certain value. But that, even though it's regulated, we do look at, what is the market value of the labor, of copper, of steel, of all those components that go into that product to create that regulated value, which is updated every year. So there are three approaches to value, and this is an appraisal principle and not just BC assessment. So there's the cost approach, and really this is looking at an informed purchaser would pay no more for a property than the cost of producing a substitute with the same utility. So again, if you look at a house, is a purchaser going to pay more for a house than it would cost them to purchase the land and build that? Probably not. So that's the premise behind the cost approach. The direct comparison approach is that an informed purchaser would pay no more for a property than the cost to acquire an existing property with the same utility. And that is typically what most property homeowner purchasers would be. You go out, you look at a number of different houses, you determine what's important to you. Do you want the ensuite? Do you want the separate bath? Do you want 5 bedrooms or 4 bedrooms? You want the basement, you want the suite. You look at all of those different components in the different houses you're looking at, and you decide which is the best one that fits your needs and the price that you're willing to pay for it. The income approach converts anticipated benefits such as rental income derived from the ownership of property into value estimates. So this is a lot of commercial property where they're renting the property out. So the property owner is getting an income stream every month as that business is renting. And then they have some expenses that they have to deduct from that. So that income stream has a value attached to it. Same thing with rental apartments. The property owner is getting all of that rental income from those apartments, and there's a value attached to that which gets capitalized into a total value for that property. We see that a little bit in residential properties with suites. Now, as property values increase, property owners do look at suite income to, help them afford the mortgage. So sometimes suites can be challenging on the residential property side, just so we don't typically look at a capitalized approach there for those properties.
What's your source?
Yeah.
I'm just curious what your baseline source is like for the income approach.
But we would be
renters or commercial properties have to provide financial statements?
Yes, so we do mailouts every year for those types of properties to get income returns from them as well, as well as expenses and with rental apartments, well, we do the same thing. It's also easier through CMHC. There's a lot of information that's available through CMHC. So non-market valuation, or regulated rates. So continuous structures. So again, your cable, your telephone, railways, pipelines, all of those types of long, skinny things, we call them, are valued at regulated rates. Major industrial properties, so things like large sawmills, pulp mills, are valued that way. Electrical power generation plants, farms. So farms get regulated rates if they meet certain criteria. It's a voluntary program where they can get a reduced assessment. Managed forests, so those would be things like the Timber West type properties are often in managed forests. And Section 19.8, so if you're not familiar with this, this is a section of the Assessment Act that allows property owners in residential properties that have a higher and better use. They can apply, and they do have to apply every single year if they meet certain criteria, such as they've owned and lived on the property for the last 10 years, that they can get the residential property value of that property as compared to the highest and best use value of that property. So for example, if a property on Main Street from the Milltown video, say it could be developed into an apartment complex, for example, or a commercial building. That use would generate a much higher value than what just having a little old house on that property would typically value. So under Section 19.8, if they meet the criteria, they could be assessed at that lower residential value rather than the much higher highest and best use value. So we're going to get into highest and best use in a minute, but. That was the same slide. So highest and best use. So that's the foundation of market value. And really, it's, as it says there, it's the most reasonable probable use of a property that is physically possible, legally permissible, financially feasible, and maximally productive. So what is physically possible? That's really constrained physically by the site itself. Like, how large is it? What's the topography? What's the geotechnical constraints of it? What services are available to it? So those are all the physical aspects of a property that can limit the highest and best use. Legally permissive, and that really comes down to what controls, land use controls are in place, whether it's something attached to title, whether it's the zoning, the OCP, any of those factors that would affect the legal use of the property. Is it in the ALR? Like, all of those factors need to be considered. And then, once you've narrowed those uses, then we look at what is financially feasible. So, what is actually, viable putting on that site. So maybe, is it best to build a 2-story apartment, 10-story apartment? Is it feasible at all financially to build a mill there? Or, is that just not even financially possible? Maximally productive, then takes a look at those uses and says, okay, well, if I build I can build an apartment building. Should I build, a 2, a 4, or a 6-story? Well, the vacancy is, I'd have too much vacancy if I built a 6-story. So even though I could build it, I'm not going to get the most return out of that. So that's sort of looking at maximally productive. So again, this is just starts local government. Is often the base for, where we look for sort of the legally permissive side of things, things such as rezoning, if things are changing, redevelopment, what's the market demand? Is there any market demand for this zoning? Just because it zones something or allows a use, doesn't mean that the market will actually pay for that. An interesting example that we have seen in the city of Victoria over the last number of years is that zoning actually isn't driving the market anymore. It's actually the OCP. Developers are paying based on what the OCP says they can do. So it just, we're always looking at where's the market demand and how is that reflecting and showing up in the market. So, and then we're creating our assessments as of July 1st, valuation date. But again, an important piece here is that October 31st is our physical condition date. So if a rezoning happens or redevelopment happens, September, we are going to be reflecting that for a valuation date of July 1st because our physical condition date is October 31st. So do you have any questions on highest and best use? It's one of our pivotal valuation concepts. So, yep.
Could you just repeat that? October 31st is the condition date?
Yes.
So you look at the value on July 1st?
Yes.
But then up till October 31st, I guess somebody physically has to
Yeah,
look
so
at the
so
building?
so if a property was just zoned, say, residentially as of July 1st, but it got rezoned to multifamily, they could put an apartment in as sometime in September or before October 31st, we would reflect the value of that higher use as of July 1st market condition. So
it's only for a higher use?
Or lower. I mean, typically it doesn't go lower, but yes, if it did go lower, we would reflect that. Or a restriction came in that they couldn't do something with a property. Okay. So classification. So we have 9 different property classes. I'm going to go through each of them here. But why do we look at different property classes? It's really to allow a variable tax rate system. So that different tax rates can be applied to different property types. You can also get partial or complete exemptions from assessment and taxation, but those reside in other acts other than the Assessment Act, whereas the classification resides within the Assessment Act. So Class 1, so provincially, turning my page here. So provincially, about 87% of the folios are in Class 1. And as you can see, there's the different types there. For the most part, Class 1 is fairly straightforward. Single-family residences, condominiums, apartment buildings, seasonal dwellings, vacant residential land, mobile home parks, farm buildings, daycare facilities. I don't know, is Airbnb, is that a concern at all here?
We're just starting to put zoning in and allowances around that, so it's not really hasn't been as big of an issue here as it has in other communities, but we're definitely seeing more and more.
Yeah, and what we do see, they do fall within Class 1. That's where they do fall. I know there is some questions around, should it be Class 6 or Class 1, but it has fallen into Class 1. Class 2, so this is utilities. So these are, again, what we call the long skinny things. And, again, transportation by railways, pipeline, generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity, telecommunications, communication towers, cable television. One thing to note, though, is that, if you have a Shaw building, for example, if they have their retail center out front, that would be in Class 6. But then if they have an area in the back where their technicians work and, they have storage of their equipment, that could be in Class 2. So you can get some split classifications on that. then class 3, which is supportive housing. I don't believe you have any supportive housing in Port Alberni. I have a slide a bit later showing the differences, if we do or not, but those are properties that are passed through order in council. So they have to apply for it, and they have to meet the criteria, and then the cabinet passes an order in council to grant them class 3. And really, what the target here is really for at-risk persons. So people who have mental illness, recovering from drug and alcohol, or have other barriers to housing. And then there also needs to be supportive services on site, for those individuals as well. So, and when those are assessed, they're assessed at $1 on the land and $1 for the buildings. So I think.
Our homeless shelter, which is just recently opened up, is this the class that it would be in the supportive housing?
Only if it got passed through order in council.
Yeah, so I think, I would be shocked if we had none in our community that met those requirements. So it would just be that maybe they haven't applied?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I do have a slide coming up that will,
Sure.
and we can look to see if you have anything in that class.
Okay, thank you.
Or I could just peek ahead. Yeah, no, you don't have any class 3 on your assessment roll.
Interesting.
So,
Go ahead.
So I have a question. So people who own houses, right, and they might be the only ones in there, but they are supportive. They have workers coming in and looking after them, because they don't have a place to go, so they're staying in their own house and having people in. Could they apply for that?
I don't believe that would qualify.
So it has to be
yeah,
sort of agency owned.
Doesn't have to be necessarily, I'll say, agency owned, although often nonprofits do own these types of properties.
Mm-hmm.
But just trying to think.
Because we have a lot of seniors, we
Yeah.
have a lot of people who have disabilities and
Yeah.
that, and they have a team of supportive people coming in
Yeah.
and looking after them and that. Or otherwise they would have to go to another
Yeah.
facility or something like that.
Yeah, I think this is more at barriers to housing, so they would be homeless otherwise.
Okay.
So, like the homeless shelter, I think is a good example potentially, where they might potentially be able to qualify for class 3.
Okay.
It sounds like these individuals, while they need support, they wouldn't necessarily be homeless.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
So-
Okay, thank you.
So class 4 is the major industry in power generation. And I'm just going to so I think these properties, for the most part, are fairly self-explanatory. Really, the key piece to these types of properties is that they have to usually meet a capacity in order to qualify for Class 4. So, for example, sawmills can often fall into Class 5 or Class 4, and it would just depend on the production volume that they have. So. And again, here the improvements are valued using the legislated costing manuals and depreciation rates, but the land itself is still assessed on market values. And as I mentioned previously, even though there's legislated costing manuals, those are still based on a market value basis as we look at the inputs into constructing those improvements. Class 5, this is called light industry, and often there's a lot of confusion between light industry and major industry. And they're quite significantly different property classes. So while they can deal with, extracting, processing, and manufacturing, similar to what a mine or a sawmill would have, it also includes a lot of different types of properties, such as, here they say the scrap metal yards, wineries, breweries, the post office is in Class 5. Any kind of distribution type center, as long as it's not for food goes into Class 6, but any distribution gets Class 5. So I noted, I looked at your tax rates, and I see your Class 4 and your Class 5 are very similar tax rates. And sometimes what that will involve is sometimes we'll get appeals because people look at the tax rates and then try to get into different property classes based on that. So. In a lot of Class 5 properties, depending on the owner, so they'll often transfer between Class 5 and Class 6. So because often they'll just be normal warehouses. So one owner might be using it to distribute, I'll say maybe it's a liquor distributor. But the next owner, they're just using it, for, just a normal warehouse where they're storing their vehicles or something. One's Class 5, one's Class 6. So it's just use dependent rather than it's use dependent, but it can just fluctuate really easily back and forth, more so than what Class 5 and Class 4 do. So Class 6 does include anything that's not included in any other property class. All the other property classes are very specific and have a lot of case law behind them. So Class 5, as I showed there, that's some examples. As the first bullet point there is not quite verbatim, but it covers the main points of the actual legislation there. But there's a lot of case law behind Class 5. There's been a lot of appeals going to stated case, Court of Appeals, Supreme Court, to decide what Class 5 actually is. And then, like I say, anything else really just falls into Class 6. If it's not covered in the other classes, it gets Class 6. So sometimes there can be some surprising properties in there. And as an example, sometimes you'll see a church in Class 6 because they haven't met the requirements to get into Class 8, for an example. Class 7, I don't think you have any managed forest land in Port Alberni. Again, there's a bunch of requirements that have to be met in order to qualify for Class 7. And again, there's regulated rates similar to farmland valuation. Class 8 is the recreational property and nonprofit organizations. And as it says there's two very different uses captured in this property class. The regulation outlines some very specific outdoor use activities, such as stated there, parks, marinas, golf, skiing, tennis, etc. But the improvements would still fall into Class 6 because it only applies to the land. The second portion of Class 8 is around public worship and meeting halls by a nonprofit. So churches, the worship area of a church would qualify for Class 8, and meeting halls of nonprofit organizations, assuming they meet those criteria of 150 days, there's no sale or consumption of alcohol within those 150 days, would qualify also for Class 8. Any other questions on, often questions around Class 8? And they can sell alcohol or consume alcohol. It's just they'd still have to have 150 days clear of that. So if there's a special event, or they're renting their hall out for a wedding or something like that, they could still do that. It's just would have to be the majority of the time. That 150 days wouldn't have to be used or set aside.
So for example, Legions wouldn't fall in this category, would they? Because they have a continuous alcohol license.
Yeah, often they'll have separate, they'll have a separate meeting hall that can qualify for Class 8, whereas the restaurant portion, it would get Class 6.
Yeah. Okay.
And then farms, Class 9. Again, this is there's a bunch of requirements around how to qualify for farm. It is an application that farmers need to make in order to qualify. They have to produce and make sales each year, and depending on the level of or the size of their farm would depend on how often they have to prove they're qualifying. So the larger the operation, the less we actually ask them to prove that they're continuing to farm. Whereas if you get into the really small, check the size. So if you're less than 1.98 acres, as an example, you have to make $10,000 a year, and you'd have to prove that fairly continuously in order to get farm class. Whereas if you are, a larger operation, over 10 acres, you'd have to make $2,500, and then 5% of that for the remaining. So, if you've got 100 acres, for the other 90 acres, you'd have to make. There's some math there. Anyways, I can't do it on the fly. But anyways, you'd have an extra amount on that. And then again, just depending on how much they would submit would affect how often we'd actually ask them to prove. Because if you're an established farm and making, we try not to make them jump through the hoops all the time. Whereas if you're a marginal farmer, we really want to make sure, are you really still farming? Because it is a very beneficial property class to be in from a taxation perspective. Okay, so that's it for the property classes. Any final questions on those? You're a quiet group. We're all thinking about dinner. So this is the Provincial assessment roll for 2019. And my papers are falling. So for here, as I say, so 77% of the dollar value is in Class 1 and has 93% of the folios. It's also where you typically see the most growth in your non-market change, which we'll talk about in a minute. And it's also and then the second biggest property class, let's see if I make this work, is your Class 6, which is 17% of the value and 6% of the folios. So what does this kind of mean overall? It means the biggest impact on your assessment roll is Class 1, followed by Class 6. And then here's Port Alberni. So as you can see, again, the biggest value is in the Class 1. And here you have 75% of the value as compared to 77% provincially, so again, fairly close, and 85.6% of the folios as compared to 93% provincially. And similarly, Class 6 is the second largest with 19% of the total value and 14.4% of the folios. So again, roughly in line with what we're seeing provincially. As you see, there's no class 3 on there and no class 7. Any questions on that? You still need a moment to absorb. Okay.
I'm just musing. I would suspect that there will be a class 3 at least in the homeless shelter coming up, probably in the next roll, I would think, because it's new. It's just, when did it open?
Well, if the process is they have to apply for it, they have told us that they are not applying for it.
Okay.
But I'm just wondering, I mean, we have other housing in our community that I believe would fit that classification. So it seems to me like possibly organizations might not be aware or haven't applied for it for whatever reason.
The gay cause.
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah, and it's just something to be aware of, if, sometimes these groups will, approach you for permissive exemption or whatever. It's just, good to be aware of, potentially all the different avenues available to them. So exemptions. So we kind of talked about classification. So the next step, we look at exemptions. So an exemption is applied by BC Assessment, and really what it is a release from paying all or a portion of the tax levied by yourselves. Common exemptions are usually either statutory or permissive, and statutory exemptions, are granted through various legislation. I think I've got that in the next slide. So commonly the community charter, which gives statutory exemptions through section 220 of the community charter. And those would be things for like the exempting municipal properties, churches, schools. So a lot of just those public type properties as well. Section 224 grants the authority for the municipality to grant the permissive exemptions. So that can be for things like the nonprofit associations, the meeting halls and land associated with churches. Those types of things. The other acts do have exemptions for other properties. So the School Act also looks at exempting universities as an example. Hospital Act exempts health authorities and hospitals. I guess the University Act would do the universities. And as I mentioned previously, it's class 3. I guess that's not an exemption, but that's an order in council. Section 19.8, that's a reduction in assessment, but not an exemption, just to be clear on that. That's all I had on exemptions. Okay. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about sort of information collection and how we gather our information and kind of process that goes through a little bit to get to the assessment role. So we used to, go out and measure houses and look at plans and then enter it all in manually. So that's how we used to do it. And now we use technology a lot more. It's a lot more of a digital world out there. We can access air photos. We fly our own air photos, regularly across the province. Digitally getting things from the municipalities, working with municipalities for building plans. We also do things like desktop review, where we take air photos, overlay them, with the properties so we can see what's there. Last year we started a process where we looked at change detection. So we'd actually overlay 2 years of air photos and it would actually highlight where changes had happened in properties. So that was quite interesting and really trying to pull out, where changes have happened. And as you can see, there's, we can get 3D images, we get the street front view. So we can go all the way around the property with the 3D angle oblique imagery. So it's quite a unique, shouldn't say unique necessarily, but it's a really good way of looking at properties and seeing what has changed. And just a way we're leveraging technology. We've tested in Vancouver. I don't think you're here yet, but doing 3D GIS modeling, looking at view corridors, how does buildings interact with each other, airspace, all those different aspects of valuation. For income, cost, and investment properties, there's a lot of different ways we get information. Part of that is through inspection and municipal information. So we do receive permits for all property types from the municipality. But we also, look at a lot of real estate publications. MLS is a big resource. It's also for residential properties as well. Interviews with vendors, purchasers, and realtors is especially important for this property type. So this is kind of your class 5 and 6 type properties. We don't get a lot of sales in that property group, so what information we do get, we have to be very, very confident on. And inquiries and appeals. So again, those are an opportunity for us to interact with those property owners and gather more information. And then, as I mentioned previously, we do send out a lot of information requests. And as always, with BC Assessment, an information request is required through legislation to be responded to. There is enabling legislation in the Assessment Act for that. And information requests can be, for income and expenses, vacancy, rents, could be from a sale, so a questionnaire on a sale. We want to know all this information around the sale. How did you negotiate the price? What was interesting to you about this property? So we have a lot of different questions. We'll ask about that. Information requests on the residential type side, again, sales questionnaires. We do send a lot of questionnaires, even just around improvements, asking property owners, what have you done to your house? And we actually get really good responses from that. We can get upwards of 60 to 80% response when we do a mail out on those. So it's quite encouraging that people are responding to us and providing us that information. Not sure what my next. So any other questions kind of on information collection?
I have a question on it. Sometimes you get a subdivision built, and in that subdivision is the house that's been there forever, right? A little house. And so, of course, the assessment goes up because of that subdivision. So how do you handle that? Because I get a lot of people talk to me about that, like, just because they built this whole new subdivision, my taxes have gone up. Mm-hmm.
Again, we always would go back to market value. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of aspects that go into market value, and often the land value when you get a new subdivision going in, it will be influenced by that. And that property may also benefit from, if there's new services going in, if you've got water and sewer and street lights and sidewalks and all those services that people do typically pay more for. If it's affected by those, then its market value will probably also go up. However, having said that, I would hope we're not, we wouldn't be comparing that house, to the new houses being built within that new subdivision. We would also be looking at, houses of a similar age and character outside of that subdivision to indicate that the value, is correct. So, okay. Does that?
So I guess basically they are to make that phone call to you with
Yeah.
pictures to support any
Yeah.
documents and stuff
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, absolutely. You know,
what I
especially, you know, if, you know, the condition is quite inferior to, you know, other similar properties, we may not be aware of that. And yeah, it is important to have that conversation. And, you know, we can also provide those sales evidence to the property owner.
Okay, so, and then, you don't mind if I go. So the other statements have been out there too, that the, like you said, you actually come physically and take a look at everything, but now you can do it electronically and different things. So when do you actually come and take a look, other than having Google drive around and do their thing, so you can take a look? Or do you wait for someone to apply and say, hey, this is not what my house really looks like, you know, comparing to everybody else?
Yeah, so we don't necessarily rely on Google.
Well, I'm just throwing
I know,
that, 'cause
I
you
know.
see Google driving around all the
I know.
time. Yes.
You know, we actually go out and take our own street front photos. And we do have reassessment cycles that we do as well.
Okay, so you do come
So
up.
we do get out there. However, you know, the property owners is a good source of information, and that's why it is critical for them to look at their assessment in January. And, you know, market value is typically understood by most people, or, you know, at least you can get there by, these sales are similar to mine. I guess it's right, you know. So at least it's understandable by individuals. So if they think it's really just not right, you know, we do welcome, you know, that feedback from the property owner, and we will make those corrections. And we do trust the property owners when they provide information to us. You know, that we trust that they're providing us with the right information. Sometimes, you know, there's things that'll trigger us that, you know, we do want to take an extra step here. But for the most part, you know, if a property owner provides us with photos and, you know, a description of their property, they provide some quotes from a contractor, like, we can reflect all of that into their property assessment.
So one more thing too is, unfortunately, years ago, the assessment office left Port Alberni. You know, we actually had a physical
Yep.
assessment office, but we have a lot of seniors
Yep.
that do not know the steps. I mean, I've had seniors come up to me and I go, well, here's what you do, right? Has the assessment office ever thought of coming, and when the assessments go out, to have something at Echo Center, hey, anybody that's like seniors or has disability, come and talk to us for information, or take them through the steps?
I believe you asked this in
I know.
January when I was here.
And I'm asking
So,
again.
you know, it is on my, I don't have an answer for that. I think it is a really interesting collaborative idea to do. You know, whether that's feasible or not, I don't know
It would
at
be
this
great
point.
if you
So, and I don't know, exactly what that would necessarily look like.
Okay,
But
thank you.
yeah. Okay. So, collecting all of that information and getting it kind of rolls into what we call non-market change. And often, you know, we call this new construction, which is a bit of a misnomer because, well, it does include new construction. You know, it also includes things like demolition and subdivisions, you know, your zoning changes, boundary extensions, property class changes, exemption status changes. And what's really important about this is that it's really a new source of revenue for the municipality. And quite often, you know, the municipality will, you know, fund, you know, new projects, you know, based on the market change that comes in every year. So one of the big things is we do rely heavily on getting those permits, which we do. And I know we're looking at, one of the things we'd really like to do is get them submitted electronically to us. And I know the planning department's working on that. So, but yeah, that would be, it would help your on-market change because things get automatically uploaded into our system, and things like decks and garages and carports get automatically added. They get reviewed, but they would automatically get added to our system, and it saves on the keying and time. You know, it's a much more efficient process for us, and again, just helps with the non-market change. So here's historically what the non-market changes looked like the last 5 years or so. 2017 is when we did a desktop review in Port Alberni, and that's normal. You typically see a spike in your non-market change when we do that. So. So assessment appeals. So I think most of you are familiar mostly with the process. We kind of actually start in December, where we actually send early notification letters out to property owners. So those letters go to property owners where their assessment is changing, usually between 15 and 20% greater than the average assessment within the municipality. So that's part of our goal of having no surprises to the property owner. So we send them a letter basically saying your assessment's going to this, please call us if you have any concerns. And that way, if we did err, then we can make that correction earlier, rather than them getting a surprise in January, and it's kind of busy with everybody getting their assessment notices. So we try to provide that level of service to property owners in December. We send out about 50,000 letters each year. We don't get a lot of calls. I'm just going to guess and say it's probably in the 1% to 2% range on those letters. And those letters also include, like, if they're changing property class or exemption status changes. So those letters would also capture any of those changes. So again, it's a tax implication to the property owner. So we're just trying to let them know. And then in January, the assessment notices go out. Owners can review their assessments, contact us if they have questions, go to our website. Our assessment search function just gets better every year, and is a good tool for property owners to review their assessments. January 31st is the appeal deadline. That is legislated, and there isn't many times that the Property Assessment Review Panel or the board will accept a late appeal. And really, it has to be shown that third-party intervention has happened. So I didn't receive my assessment notice. I didn't look at my assessment notice. I was on vacation. I was out of the country. None of those defenses have been successful at the board level. And one of the things is, your assessment comes every January. You can look online if you're out of the country. You can have your mail forwarded. So all of those things. So it is really critical, that people do look at their assessment in January, and if they have concerns, to contact us, and appeal by the 31st. So through February to March 15th, again, that's a legislated deadline, so we can't sit later than that. Those are firm dates. And the Property Assessment Review Panel conducts hearings. This year, just again, I know it'll be a change, and you may hear about it. There is a telephone conference is the standard this year. For appeals, and my understanding is I don't believe the Property Assessment Review Panel is going to be sitting in Port Alberni this year. So I think they'd have to go to Parksville, would be the closest, I think. And just so you know, like that's a provincial change that the Property Assessment Review Panel is making as part of their leveraging technology and costs. So once the Property Assessment Review Panel is heard, the revised roll comes out at the end of March, in which you then set your tax rates. And then property owners have until April 30th to appeal to the Property Assessment Appeal Board. And that's a more formal process. Currently, there's a cost of $30. I believe that is under review for next year. And that $30 fee has been, I think, since the 70s. Might have been the 80s. It's been there a long time. It hasn't changed. So some changes are coming there. And these changes are all just part of the tribunal review that the province is doing, where they're reviewing all of their tribunal processes across the board. So for PARP and PAB, so the appeal board and the review panel, they're both appointed by government, and they're independent of BC assessment. They're also independent of taxing jurisdictions. Their mandate is that they can review the assessed value, classification, exemptions, and ownership. And the decisions are based on the review of evidence presented and available at the hearing. Important to note that the appeal board decisions can only be appealed to the BC Supreme Court and Court of Appeal, and then further on, only on a question of law. So somebody can't appeal their appeal board decision because they just don't think the value is right. It has to actually be on a point of law that the appeal board erred. So. So just an interesting graph just showing the percentage of folios appealed from 1974 to 2019. So 10-year average is provincially about 1.3% of folios. In Port Alberni, we had 4 appeals to the Property Assessment Appeal Board for 2018 and 10 for the 2019 roll, so not too many. Did you get a decision?
My process this time around,
Yeah.
this is the second time on 2 different properties, but this time around was actually a really good experience. My assessment came through within about a 19% increase, and I looked at our community average and I went, yike. Yeah. And I had a date set up to appeal, go before the board, but a staff member contacted me by phone, and we had a pretty good, significant conversation, and we arrived at a good decision for both parties over the phone. So it actually preempted me from having to come back to Port Alberni because I was on holidays at that time for that one.
So did you go to the review panel or the appeal board?
The review panel.
The first panel, okay, yeah.
Yeah, the first panel.
Yeah, so these stats were for actually the next level.
Right.
So the appeal board level. Yeah. And you have to appeal to the review panel before you can go to the board. You can't just bypass the review panel.
My first experience was a little more tense. I had to go before them, and I had all the photos and everything, and it is a little intimidating when you're sitting across the table from 4 or 5 people that you're trying to make your argument. But that turned out good too. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it is important, like if you do hear those comments, like it is an informal process, and I understand it can be intimidating, but it is informal, and we do try to make it as less intimidating as possible. But, Okay, and for PARP, the review panel, for 2019, there was 136 appeals. And I think if we go back, there's just over 9,000 folios in the jurisdiction, so not too bad. 2018, coincidentally, there was also 136. I had to double check that to make sure I wasn't just putting the same number down, but and then in 2017, there was 82 appeals. So part of that trend isn't unexpected. In 2018, the 2019 roll, we did see both substantially increasing markets, and when you do have increasing markets, typically, the appeals also increase as people just want to make sure they're being treated fairly. So, okay, risk to roll. So risk to roll is what we consider, you receive your revised roll at the end of March. So from BC Assessment's perspective and municipality's perspective, risk is anything that would affect the roll after that date. Because at that point, you've set your mill rate, you've got your budget, you're set to go. So if we have any significant appeals or supplementary assessments that come in, so where we need to make corrections to the assessment roll, I stay in communication with city staff to make sure that they're aware of what's happening, so that they know if there's contingencies, funds that need to be set aside, that they're in communication with you. And what we do as well in order to ensure that risk to roll is communicated accurately is BC Assessment does provide. That is the slide. does provide assessment roll reporting to the municipality staff, and we do one at mid-year and one at year-end. So typically we look at somewhere between June and August. Once we get all of our property assessment appeal board appeals in, we can kind of see what's appealed. We can have a few conversations with owners to kind of see where they're coming from and really understand that risk from the appeals side of things. So then we can communicate that out accurately. We also have a year-end report, which typically will come in January, which again, any outstanding appeals will be covered off, as well as any other summary of the changes that had happened through any supplementary assessments as well. The report includes your appeal summaries, non-market change, early market trends for your mid-year report, changes on assessed value, any assessment initiatives, so any projects that we're doing throughout the year, and any update on statute changes and major appeal decisions. We're going to get to some fun stuff here in a minute. So as we mentioned before, we've got key dates, January 31st, it's inquiry period, and then we've got the appeals, first level of appeals through February, March. April through September, we're just really looking at, projects. It's making sure we get all of our new construction on the roll. We're working on PAB, we're reviewing sales. We're kind of just doing a lot of core work to maintain and update the assessment roll. October, we really dive into our roll production, which we're just about finishing up now. We're just in the tail end of it. October 31st is our physical condition and permitted use date, as we discussed earlier. November 30th, and this one sometimes can get confusing, that's what we reflect ownership. So any ownership changes as of November 30th in land registered in land titles is what we'll reflect. So if somebody buys a property December 1st, their assessment will not go to them. Their assessment will go to the old owners. So just something to be aware of. We do in January send a letter to all December purchasers as part of our transparency saying, you purchased a property, you're not going to get the assessment notice, go online and look, essentially. So we do try to cover those property owners off that are kind of caught in the middle. December 31st, we mail the notices. December 31st is also liability for taxation. So that's if there's a tax code change. So for example, if you're leasing a municipal property to an occupier, if they exit on December 31st and that ownership reverts back to the municipality, we would make that reflection on the assessment roll. The Act gives us that ability. By the same token, something that gets quite confusing is if there's a subdivision that happens that's registered, say, December 10th, but you as the municipality purchase a park December 30th, we would actually process that full subdivision for the assessment roll. Even though normally, because it was registered after November 30th, we would not, because November 30th is our cutoff date. So if you purchase parks in December, you're going to get those on the roll. Mobile homes as well, those properties have a December 31st ownership cutoff through legislation as well, so you'll often see a lot of those changes go through the review panel. So, any questions on any of that? Okay. Relationship between assessment and taxation. So essentially, assessed value times your property tax rate equals your taxes payable. I think that's fairly straightforward. If we can get the video. Get the video?
Meet the Johnsons. They live in a typical BC municipality. They are homeowners, and each January, they receive a property assessment notice from BC Assessment, along with all other property owners in BC. Later in the spring, they also receive a property tax notice from their local municipality. Property taxes are determined by your local municipality and based on the assessment value provided by BC Assessment. Let's assume an imaginary town has 3 properties, and all 3 properties have the same assessment value of $100,000. Assuming the total taxes needed to balance this town's budget is $900, then the tax rate must be set at $900 divided by 100,000 plus 100,000 plus 100,000, which equals $0.003. In order to collect the $900 needed for the town to operate for the year, that means each property would have to pay $100,000 times $0.003, or $300. Each property pays their share of taxes based on their assessment value. This looks simple, but let's see what happens the following year when assessment values change. House number 1 is assessed at $150,000, house number 2 at $100,000, and house number 3 at $70,000. House number 1's assessed value increased by 50%. House number 2's stayed the same, while house number 3's decreased by 30%. In this scenario, the town's average assessment value increased by $150,000 plus $100,000 plus $70,000 divided by 3, equaling $106,667, or 6.67%. If the total taxes needed to balance the town's budget are the same in year 2 at $900, then a new tax rate must be calculated in order to balance the budget. $900 divided by $150,000 plus $100,000 plus $70,000, which equals $0.0028125. That means the taxes that each house pays in year 2 will change to $421.88 for house number 1, $281.25 for house number 2, and $196.87 for house number 3. The town still collects the $900 needed to operate for the year, but compared to year 1, each house will pay a difference of plus $121.88 for house number 1, minus $18.75 for house number 2, and minus $103.13 for house number 3. As you can see, how your taxes change each year depends on how your assessment changes in comparison to the average assessment changes in your city. In our example, the average assessment increased by 6.67% to
You have to bear with me. I gotta. Oh, can you? Yep. Yep. Okay. Yeah, so essentially BC Assessment's job is to make sure that the taxes are allocated fairly between similarly situated property owners. So, no, this is a very simplistic example. And yes, the challenges are certainly there. So I believe something similar to this goes on the assessment notice, but if not, it's certainly on our website. But this is one of the big concerns for a lot of property owners, how is my assessment really going to affect my taxes? That's really the question most people have. So, if your average change is lower, then your taxes are likely to decrease, again, depending on what the budget is. If it stays the same, they're likely to decrease. If it's similar, then your taxes are likely not to change. And if it's higher than average, then your taxes are likely to increase. So those are the messages that we do provide property owners to help them gauge kind of what their taxes might be doing. And the other piece with that is always, to bring it back to market value. So again, just because your assessment's decreased or increased, is it right? And that's the other question we'll ask property owners: is your assessment right? Don't worry about what everybody else is doing. Let's first focus on, is your assessment right? If the value's right, then, let's see, whether it's equitable. So, this is just an Nanaimo property. I just, we had this in our slide deck, so just sort of wanted to show, this property, I think it's from 2017 value, but it just sort of shows the relationship between taxes and the assessed value. So the taxes are on the right-hand side, the assessed value is on the left, and the assessed value is the red dotted line, and the bars are the taxes. So you can see that the assessed value has increased about 270%, and the taxes since 1991 have increased 35%. Or maybe that's I probably calculated it from 93. So over that time, it's kind of in line with kind of inflation, right? Whereas the assessment's gone up, so much more. So, okay, this is just provincially. I think we've kind of touched on this already. You can see the total value as a graph since 1975. And the folio count provincially is increased. So again, this is last year. So Vancouver Island region, anywhere from fairly flat up to 25% increases. In line, the rest of the province, kind of see they're quite variable. Strata, again, quite similar, and similar trends across the province, again 0 to 25% on the island. And commercial, again, fairly similar. And I showed this is the same slide as earlier, but here, or maybe not. What I really wanted to highlight here is the fact that, when you're distributing property taxes, different property classes can be increasing by different percentages. So here, Class 1 is last year increased by 17.37%, whereas your Class 6 increased by just about 5%, and your Class 5 by 7.4%. And that would have been changed due to market. There'd be, you can see the other column there, which looks at non-market change by property class. So again, that can influence, you know, how taxes get apportioned throughout a municipality as well. And it's not as significant here, but sometimes, you know, if you have your strata and residential market moving quite differently within a municipality, that can influence and impact, again, that apportionment of taxes between those two subclasses within the residential.
Just a quick question.
Yep.
So when people reach the age of 65, and that, of course, or however it works, it goes down, their taxes. So how do you play that up on the chart?
That's part of a grant process and is
Right.
not
it
part of.
doesn't affect you at all?
No.
Okay, so it is. Okay, thank you.
I'm assuming that's what you're talking about, where they can get the part of the homeowner grant or in the, yeah. Okay. There's a slide just looking at the past 5 years for the residential SFD market. As I said, the 2018-2019 rolls, we're seeing some significant market movement. I might have it coming up here, but this year, again, we're looking at probably another 10 to 15% increase in Port Alberni. So. The commercial market, again, they've been seeing 3 years of increases. So you just sort of see a bunch of different municipalities. You see where Port Alberni is certainly at the lower end of the, say, affordability range, with the average assessment at $278,000, which is probably why, you know, you're seeing some significant market movement. It's still perceived as a very affordable place to be. You even look at, you know, Courtney and Comox there at $450 and $517. As compared to Victoria at $842. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the distribution of values, and I just looked at SFDs here. And those are ranges. I know they didn't all show, but basically 75 up to the 150, and then up to 225. They're in $75,000 increments. So as you can see, not surprising that the highest number of properties is in that 225 to 300 range, since our median assessment is, average assessment's of around 278. Just gonna flip pages here. I've got some more handouts for you.
Is this 2018 or 2019?
That'd be the 2019 assessment roll. So there is 4 folios under 75,000. And these 4 folios are either part constructed improvements or properties that are ready for demolition. You know, so their condition is extremely poor. But I'm going to hand these out just because I know they're extremely tiny there, so I made them bigger. Just to look at some of the properties that are in each of those bins, groupings. I have them all on slides too, so. So this first slide, we're looking at the 75 to 150,000, and these are all sales. I've got the sale dates. They're all 2018 sales. Not a lot of sales in this property grouping. As expected, it is fairly small. But as you can see, the values and the sales are all fairly low. The properties are old. You can tell even from the exterior, their condition isn't very well maintained. They're older houses, that type of thing. They're also fairly small houses. And you can see they're kind of fairly central Port Alberni area as well.
Are these the assessed values for, like when it says assessed value?
Yeah.
These are 2018 sales, so these are the 2019 assessed values?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so those would be the sales that would go with that assessment. Yeah. So yeah, just let me know if you have any questions as we go through here. So the next grouping, looking at 150 to 225. Again, there's a few more sales in this price grouping. I kind of chose a few to kind of show some of the range throughout that bracket. At the low end, we've got sale price of 161,000 with the assessed value of 159. Then the next property at the 180, 190. 195 and 210. Again,
one of those did just sell for 450. So
yeah,
that's since this, but
yeah, yeah. But as you can see with these pictures, these sale prices are reflecting a property that's in this condition, probably at the 450. I'm assuming they've probably renovated it quite extensively.
So I guess my question is, like I recognize 3 of these houses as having recently sold for in the 400s. Yep. When, and I would imagine because of the significance of the work that was done, that permits would have been pulled on that work. When is that reflected? And when do you, I mean, I know that if it's sold in 2019, it's reflected in the 2020,
yep.
But I mean, some of these are just so significant changes that have been made. Like, do those get updated when permits are pulled, or do they have to sell first?
No, assuming we're getting the permits, we would be reviewing that and looking at that. And then the sale would be the second trigger that would have us look at it.
I just look at the one that I know just sold for 450, and I mean, that permit would have been like over a year ago. Yeah. So it just seems to have it assessed, under 200,000 still seems a bit, a bit off. Somebody's getting a very nice tax bill. Yeah. No, I'm not going to feel it.
Did you, or if you want, we can maybe touch base, or you can get me some of those addresses, and we can take a look, because it is about a process and making sure we're getting the right information as well.
Well, that's just what I wonder. Yeah, I mean, I think we do have to make sure, obviously, we're getting the right information, but I know that, like, it just seems when we look at the percentage of houses that were in that under $200,000 range, whereas when you look at our actual market, you can't find a house for under 200,000. So I know it's just a year delay in the system makes a big difference, but just surprised to see some of the houses on here.
Yeah, and like I say, you look at these did sell last year, and it's just showing that this is a market that's still active, and these properties are still selling. I think with these photos, you'll see again they're not as dilapidated as those first sheet, but still looking like they need some updating and some repair, and they're older, and some of them are smaller. So, and if we go on to the next grouping, again, you just see this is a better quality house. You're getting into more of your average type properties. They're bigger, they're newer, they're maintained. Type thing. So again, I've kind of tried to pick something at each price grouping. And then the next one, when we're looking at 300 to 450. So again, you're getting into some newer houses here, some bigger houses, maintained houses. So I kind of see size, land size as well as house size. And like I say, age of the house is playing into the values a lot more here. And I don't think I had anything. Let's see what my next. Okay, I did have the two over. There was only 2 sales over 450 for last year. These were them. So it looks like 2 newer houses. So you didn't have a lot of choice if you wanted to spend over $450,000 in Port Alberni last year. And then I think here, just to your point, Mayor Minions, the renovations, because I did see that on one of the sale, and you can kind of see the before and the after, photo and the sale price that kind of tagged with that. Again, that was just a really small house. And they made it nice and cute. So any other questions kind of on that there? So that was interesting to kind of see what was selling in each kind of grouping of value and what you get for the money there. Okay, so this is a little bit of a preview. This is on our public website, so you can go and look at it. It's updated on a monthly basis. So showing the July 1st of last year right now and where the median sale price was. And as you can see, it's continued to trend up through the last 3 quarters last year and this year. So we're probably seeing a 10 to 15% increase in residential values this year. Okay. So just a little bit to close out here. It's almost done. Just collaborating with BC Assessment. So as we said, we really work together with you to ensure our fair, equitable property assessments. One of our goals is really to maintain a stable and predictable assessment role for you. So again, that the services the city provides aren't impacted adversely. And really optimizing that property tax revenue for you. And one of our other goals, as I said throughout, is that transparency, with property owners, really increasing citizen awareness of property assessments and taxation. And how do we do that? And a lot of municipalities, and I understand you're one of them, who puts links to our YouTube videos on your website, so that property owners, if they're looking at taxation, can also benefit and see how their assessment plays into it. And this is just where I wanted to make just a little note for me to follow up on your question, Councillor Solda, just about BC Assessment potentially coming out for a Q&A for citizens. Okay. So information that impacts property assessments. So it'd be building permits, building plans. So currently we do access building plans from the municipality, very cooperative with the building department, where we come out and they pull the plans for us and then we just take photographs of them. We would like to move to more of a digital procurement of them, if possible. We'll continue to work with the building department on that, but it's a challenge across the province for that. So, land use control amendments. So again, just obtaining if there's changes in land use controls, that we obtain those. Development permit or development applications and approvals. Again, the subdivision approval process. Extensions of service infrastructure. So again, if you're planning service extensions, often that will impact market value of those properties as that goes in. Permissive tax exemptions, again, those are need to be passed by council by October 31st, and then we apply those. Revitalization exemptions, I don't know, do you guys have any revitalization exemptions here? No. Mailing address changes, so again, often the mailing address changes go through BC Assessment and then it gets uploaded into your system, so again, that's sort of a benefit for both of us. And yeah, we get all the civic assignments from your staff. So how do I get involved? So again, just getting the standard building permit report program implemented. I'm talking to the building department currently and looking at hopefully getting that up and running here. Submitting electronic building plans, as I mentioned, that would be extremely helpful. Change of address, community web forum, ensuring we're on as consultation notifications. And just if there's any changes in occupied properties, so anything you're aware of, again, just making sure that that kind of gets back to us. You know, we aren't, you know, boots on the ground. Even in the municipalities where we are, you know, we can't be aware of everything, and you know, often you guys are closer to those sources. So. So resources, so we have data advice, Assessment Link BC, which your finance staff have access to. All those things we've talked about. As I said, the property information and trends, that's where that graph came from earlier about what the market is doing. That is available on our public website and is updated on a monthly basis. So if you're ever wondering kind of what the market trends are in the municipality, you can click into there. So that kind of brings me to the end.
Are there more questions?
Hi, and thanks for that presentation. I'm the city's economic development guy. One of the concerns that we have is around empty commercial buildings. So we've got a lot of them in the community, somewhere probably still north of 70. The number's going down, but there's still a lot. So nobody's leasing the building, so the assessment goes down. Is that right?
Not necessarily. We would typically be looking at what we would call an economic vacancy rate, which we would apply throughout the community.
Okay. Well, so nobody's leasing the building. The landlord isn't doing anything with the building. Sometimes because it's a tax write-off, sometimes because they don't have the ability to do anything with it. Market hasn't been strong for it, so those buildings are, a lot of them, most of them, are not up to code, either fire code or building code. And we've got a situation developing where several of them are in such disrepair that nobody's wanting to take them on. City's getting stuck with them, going to get stuck with them, tearing the building down, and then at a significant cost, and then left with a piece of property that has nowhere near the value of what the building was. Is there anything in your toolbox that would help us address that?
I don't think there would be much from an assessment perspective. If the assessment itself needs to be changed because the value is incorrect, that's one thing. Like if it's a condition issue of the property due to lack of maintenance and whatnot, that's something that's different from, like I said, economic vacancy rate that would be applied necessarily to the community. There might be something there, but as far as and maybe just to clarify your question, are you looking for trying to prevent a tax sale and give them assessment relief? Or are you looking at, what redevelopment potential there is and how does assessment affect that?
Redevelopment potential.
Yeah. So redevelopment potential, we would just be looking at market value, which would be affected by land use controls and market demand.
And like you said earlier, potentially by our OCP.
Yep.
Okay.
So, it's a frustrating situation because, I anticipate that, there's going to be significant cost accruing to the city for, as I said, I can foresee us incurring losses on several properties that aren't ours, but nevertheless having to deal with them. So it's just frustrating that there's not much there. I've often thought that because I do observe that with industrial properties, once they cease operation, their assessment normally starts to fall. And it's the same with commercial properties, and I've often thought that there needs to be another class of taxation that applies in situations where the owners are doing nothing. And we're starting to run into big issues.
Yeah, so property class and valuation are two completely separate principles. So we value first, classify second, and classification is strictly based on use. If a property is zoned commercial or industrial and it's not being used for anything, it will default to class 6. Yeah.
So a question, if I may, on a completely different vein. The city is contemplating allowing cannabis cultivation in certain properties. The Agricultural Land Commission says that cannabis cultivation is farm use. So do you know what position the assessment authority is going to take if, for example, the assessment goes into a commercial building of some sort?
Yeah, cannabis production is class 5.
Was that light industrial?
Yep.
Okay. Councillor Paulson.
I just have one comment to make, and it maybe is something we need to mull over, but in our community, we've got many homes and stuff that were built in the 50s and 40s, 60s, and certainly a lot of those homes will be in need of renovations and stuff in the future. And in my case, my house burnt down. It was built in the 50s, so we built a new house on the same property, and my property taxes doubled. Well, nothing's changed in our household. Our income hasn't changed. I understand the increased value in the home, but I guess my comment is, if you put up a sheet of gyprock in your house, you get penalized, and we have to stop penalizing people for renovations and upgrading their homes and making their homes. It might even be a formula where it's a short-term relief, over 4 or 5, in order to encourage people to do renos, rather than having the house fall into disrepair. We need to have an incentive that they would do a reno that makes our town look great, and anyway, that's just a comment that I have to make, and I'm not crying about my house,
But you are a little.
That's okay. Just thought I'd shoot that in there.
And I would say, Ron, that we do have that ability as a municipality to put in incentives for homeowners to do improvements and get, tax incentives. But that's not BC Assessment's role. Their role is to value, and when a house gets nicer, for sure, but when a house gets nicer, the value goes up. And I would say that one thing, we actually don't get a lot of increase from renovations in our community because, as we know, our permit rate for home renovations is quite low. So I think we need to encourage people to pull permits for their renos.
To declare their reno.
That's right. Pull permits for their renos, declare their renos. We'll send those along to BC Housing or BC Assessment. Yep. But especially because we do have so many houses in our community that are assessed very low, and then they do end up selling for significantly higher. I think that we have to help BC Assessment get a better understanding of our market. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Other questions? Okay. Thank you very much for all of the information. It's always helpful to get a better understanding of your processes and what we can be doing from our side of things to make sure that things are as accurate as possible. So,
well, thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come out and help you understand our process better. So great. I hope
I'll see you at the meeting for seniors in next year.
It's not a meeting for seniors.
More interested.
Thank you. Are there any public comments or questions? We do have one member of the public here. Apparently not looking to ask any questions. Tanis, you're welcome to come on up here. Okay. Would somebody like to move adjournment? All in favor? Carried.